Hey friends! Welcome back to the Animal Nerd podcast. I'm fairly certain that I'm your host, and I am so happy that you're here. Today I'm going to tell you the story of a rescued animal who helped to bring her species back from the brink, and inspired countless people around the world to get involved in marine conservation. This is the story of Rosa the otter. It was the 26th of September 1999. Being a Sunday, many people would have been off work, spending their time with family or unwinding at home. But that wasn't the case for the staff of the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Located in the Californian town of Monterey, this aquarium is a hub of marine conservation work, and the ocean doesn't really care about arbitrary human concepts like weekends. And so when, on this particular Sunday in 1999, the aquarium received a call about an abandoned sea otter pup, they didn't hesitate to spring into action. When it comes to the rescue and rehabilitation of orphaned, abandoned or stranded baby sea otters, these guys were, and still are, the people to call. But in a case like this, time is of the essence, and they rushed to the spot where this stranded baby had been found. A spot in southern Santa Cruz County between Sunset Beach and Manresa State Beach. It wasn't long until they found what they were looking for, a tiny scrap of fur calling desperately for a mother who was nowhere to be found. At only 4 weeks old, this otter pup was far too young to be separated from her mum, but despite extensive searching, the rescue team were unable to find her. The pup was already in a bad way, and it was clear to everyone that she wouldn't survive long without help. She was far too young to feed and fend for herself, and at only about a month old, she would have needed 6 more months with her mother before she was ready to strike out on her own. And so when it became clear that there was no chance of reuniting her with her mother, the aquarium staff were left with no choice but to bundle up this mewling little baby and take her home with them. In a completely accidental but utterly delightful coincidence, this episode is due to go live almost exactly 25 years to the day after Rosa was rescued. When I realised how close it was to the anniversary, I actually pushed this episode back a week to get as close to the date as I could. And so, nearly 25 years ago today, Rosa was taken back to the aquarium where she was hand-reared by their dedicated team. She was kept there for almost a year, until the April of 2000, when she was finally old enough to be released back into the wild, which is something that the Monterey Bay Aquarium do with every rescued otter that they can. But it's not as though the aquarium release animals by just dumping them out in the wild and leaving them to their own devices. Otters are fitted with tags on their flippers to allow for quick, easy identification, and are, of course, always released into carefully vetted areas. And the aquarium's duty of care to the otters doesn't end once the otters have been released. For the first 2 weeks, members of their research and conservation team will be out there every single day, tracking the newly released individual and making sure that they're not only surviving, but thriving in their new life. And of course, if they aren't for whatever reason, they're rescued again. Thankfully though, that didn't need to happen with Rosa. After being released at the age of about 7 months, the same age a wild otter would leave their mother to live independently, she took to wild living like a duck to water. Like an otter to water? Or at least she did at first. For 2 years, Rosa seemed to be living her best life. She was feeding herself, looking after herself, and just generally seemed to be getting along fine in life. She was a conservation success story, one of the countless otters who've had their lives saved by the Monterey Bay Aquarium and had gone on to return to the wild and live as nature intended, until she wasn't. I mentioned earlier that teams from the aquarium will monitor the otter daily for the first 2 weeks after release, but the aftercare doesn't end there, not by a long shot. They will continue to monitor and track the otter for as long as they can, often the otter's entire life. This is done partly to keep an eye on how the individual is doing, of course, but also to help gain powerful insight into the lives of wild sea otters, which can then be used to help conservation efforts to save their species. I know I say it a lot, but knowledge and education really is key when it comes to helping wildlife, and there's no better source to learn from than the wild animals themselves as they navigate through their lives. The more you know about them, the places they go, their favourite food sources, the threats they face, their breeding habits, anything like that, the more you can do to try and save them. And sea otters are certainly a species that need all the help they can get. There was a time when sea otter populations were thriving across the North Pacific Ocean, gracing the shores of everywhere from Japan to Mexico, Russia, and much of the US, including Alaska. There were hundreds of thousands of them across the globe, and it probably wouldn't have occurred to anyone that these adorable little creatures would ever be under threat. The thing that makes them so unbearably cute was the exact same thing that resulted in their populations being utterly decimated by humans. Sea otters actually have the densest fur of any animal on Earth. This is because sea otters only took to the seas relatively recently, at least recently in evolutionary terms. Most mammals who live out at sea have a thick layer of blubber specifically to keep them warm. Think of seals, whales, dolphins, those kinds of animals, all delightfully chonky boys. But sea otters didn't have that blubber. What they did already have, though, that other marine mammals didn't, was a beautiful full fur coat. And so rather than going through the much longer evolutionary process of developing insulating blubber, they instead just got even fluffier to protect them from the cold water they were now living in, as well as developing a ridiculously fast metabolism. But just how fluffy are these guys? Well, in only 1 square inch of their skin, they can have up to 1 million hairs growing there. If you want a comparison, we humans have about 100,000 hairs on our entire scalp, so that's the equivalent of 10 human heads of hair in only 1 square inch. Yeah, when I say these guys are ridiculously fluffy, I mean it. These guys are floof incarnate. And this obviously has the added benefit of making them just so freaking cute. They are so round and so soft and just, so pettable. I mean, not literally pettable, these guys would absolutely take your fingers off if you tried. But I want to know what that fur feels like so badly. And I'm far from the first person to think that, which is where the problem started for these guys. Their fur is nothing short of incredible, and people wanted it. Not to admire respectfully from a distance, but to wear. To turn into clothes. And from a purely objective viewpoint, I can see the appeal. Their fur is so soft and luxurious and unbeatable for warmth, but it's theirs, not ours. From the mid-18th century to the early 20th century, sea otters were persecuted relentlessly across their range. They were slaughtered in their millions, their skin torn from their bodies to fuel our insatiable desire to steal what is not ours. There was good money in the skins of sea otters, and capitalism will always prioritise profits over morality. People did eventually stop killing sea otters, but it wasn't because of some sudden compassion for our fellow living beings. It was because there were none left. They were gone. They'd been driven to extinction by mankind's arrogance and greed. Except, if they went extinct in the early 20th century, then how was Rosa born at the end of it? Well, that's a very good question. So good I could have written it myself. Sea otters were widely believed to have gone extinct. It was broadly accepted that we had wiped these beautiful, intelligent creatures from the face of the earth, with no trace of their existence left behind, save for the coats and mittens made from them. But it would turn out that that wasn't quite the case. There were some sea otters left, tiny isolated populations that had somehow survived our attempts to eradicate them, hiding away in remote, secluded areas. In 1938, a population of southern sea otters, the subspecies that Rosa belonged to, was rediscovered in a remote area of the Californian coast near Big Sur. This small group of otters consisted of only about 50 individuals, and they were the sole survivors of their subspecies. And they weren't discovered by some big conservation effort. Apparently it was just someone testing out a new telescope who happened to catch a glimpse of them in the distance. Before the fur trade, it's estimated that there was somewhere in the region of 16,000 sea otters in California alone, but now there were only a few dozen left. But while it had only been a few decades since they were being hunted to the brink of extinction, things had changed in that time. When people realised there was still a small population of southern sea otters clinging on to life, their response wasn't to, as you might expect, just resume hunting them. As is so often the case, people only realised the mistake that had been made when it was too late. Except suddenly it wasn't, not anymore. The sea otters weren't extinct, which meant there was still hope that they could be saved. And now people wanted to save them. So they set to work. It wasn't easy, but people fought on the otters' behalf, and eventually they got laws passed that protected the sea otters from being harmed by humans. People came together to do all they could to try and save the southern sea otter, and it worked. Gradually their numbers began to increase and their range began to expand. Sea otters are considered one of the greatest marine conservation success stories, which isn't to say that their future is secure. There's still a lot of threats facing them and their potential survival. Introduced diseases, water pollution, irresponsible fishing, and oil spills, to name just a few. It's estimated that California's sea otter population currently stands at around 3,000, which is a massive increase from 50, but it's still less than a quarter of their pre-fur trade numbers. And California is currently the main stronghold of the southern sea otter. they still haven't managed to reclaim most of their previous range, and their populations are still limited to a few small areas, which also makes them more vulnerable. One oil spill in the wrong place could still more or less wipe them out. So yeah, sea otters are still desperately in need of help from us humans, which feels like a slightly cruel irony as we're also the reason they ended up in this situation to begin with. But that's why every time there's a report of an otter pup separated from their mother, conservationists like those from the Monterey Bay Aquarium will race into action to save them. With a threatened species like the sea otter, every individual really does count. And speaking of individuals, let's get back to Rosa. Before we got into the history of sea otters, I left you with the hint that things maybe didn't go so well for her when she was released. Well, after 2 years of her seemingly thriving in the wild, things began to take a turn for the cute but concerning. She had begun to seek out humans, interacting with scuba divers and climbing onto kayaks. A wild otter wanting to befriend humans sounds adorable, right? Well, yeah, but it's also really not a good thing. Rosa's behaviour was putting her own safety at risk. Most wild animals need to have a fear of humans in order to survive, not to mention the fact that it was also potentially putting people at risk. Rosa didn't ever seem aggressive, but sea otters are mustelids, the same family as honey badgers and wolverines. And like all mustelids, sea otters can have a hell of a nasty bite on them. So when it became clear that this wasn't a one-off and Rosa was going to keep doing this kind of thing, the US Fish and Wildlife Service, who were the ones in charge of wild sea otters, ruled that Rosa had to be captured and returned to captivity, where she would have to remain for the rest of her life. She was officially deemed unreleasable. And so, on the 4th of March 2002, the Monterey Bay Aquarium once again rescued Rosa, bringing her back to introduce her to their small population of captive sea otters. Of course, the aim for the aquarium was always for their rescued otter pups to be returned to the wild once they were old enough, and that was usually what happened. Most of them thrived after their release and had no need to be recaptured like Rosa was. But every so often they'd find themselves with an otter who just couldn't make it out in the wild. Sometimes it was because of some kind of health problem, and other times it was behavioural, as was the case with Rosa. And those few otters who couldn't return to the wild would stay at the aquarium, where they would still be able to thrive and live long, happy lives under the expert care of the aquarium staff. I know some people are always against animals in captivity, but in the case of otters like Rosa, it's literally a case of keeping them in captivity or killing them. And by all accounts, the otters at the aquarium are living their best lives. They have varied diets, daily enrichment, and, unlike wild otters, a team of vets and experts constantly on hand to monitor their health and give them any medical treatment necessary. But that's not all. Captive sea otters like these are also a really important part of the aquarium's conservation efforts. Oftentimes, being able to see an animal in person, connecting with them and getting to know them as individuals, can really spark a desire in people to get involved in helping to save them. It can be a powerful tool in raising awareness and educating the public about the threats facing sea otters and the things they can do to help. And that's still not all. The otters at the Monterey Bay Aquarium also have another important role in helping to save their own species, and this is perhaps the most impactful of all. It started in 2002, the same year that Rosa joined them. Also, because I realised I haven't mentioned it yet, Rosa wasn't actually originally named Rosa. The first name, the one I'm assuming she was given prior to becoming a permanent resident, was Faye, after a character from a John Steinbeck novel, since most of Steinbeck's novels were set in Central California, where he was from. Since the Monterey Bay Aquarium is also in Central California, they name all their otters after his characters as a tribute. However, when Faye joined the otters on exhibit, there was a bit of a problem, as they already had an otter named May. Two animals with similar names may not seem like much of an issue, but the aquarium staff use clicker training, which serves as both mental enrichment and, more importantly, allows them to monitor and care for the otter's health without causing them any stress. And part of the training involves teaching the otters their names, which is why they were worried that having two otters with nearly indistinguishable names would cause confusion. And because May was there first, it was Faye who had to forfeit her name. Thus she became Rosa, another Steinbeck character, of course. But what was the thing I was telling you about before I got distracted? The big thing the otters do to help save their species? Well, staff at the aquarium had noticed how the older otters often seemed to take the younger ones under their wing, bonding closely with them and caring for them, which was somewhat surprising as the aquarium didn't breed their otters. The only ones they kept there were females. None of them would have had experience having and raising their own babies, and yet they clearly had a strong maternal instinct towards younger individuals. So noticing this, they decided to try something new. something that I don't think had ever been tried before in otters. They presented an otter with one of the abandoned babies they'd been hand-rearing, and she immediately adopted it as her own child, treating it exactly the same way she would if she was a wild otter with a pup she'd given birth to herself. And it wasn't a one-off. They actually found that most of their female otters were more than willing to become adoptive mothers if given a chance, and that they all did an exceptional job of caring for their foster children. The Monterey Bay Aquarium's surrogacy program, as it would come to be known, was a massive success. The babies thrived under the love and care of their new mums, and being raised among their own kind meant that they were actually learning how to be otters, which, combined with the fact that it would have limited their exposure to people, no doubt would have increased their success when they were finally able to return to the wild. Rosa wasn't initially part of this program, as she was still very young herself. It wasn't until 2005 that she was given her first baby, and Rosa proved to be an exceptional mother. She would go on to rear 15 rescued otter pups over the course of her life, making her one of the most successful surrogate mothers in the program's history. You might think that raising all of those orphaned babies was the thing that Rosa would become best known for. After all, that's a pretty major contribution to the survival of her species, not to mention that it's also just incredibly wholesome. But actually, Rosa went on to become something of an online celebrity in her own right. The Monterey Bay Aquarium have a strong online and social media presence, as is pretty much a requirement for any non-profit these days, and one of their most popular offerings is their Otter Live Cam. This is exactly what it sounds like. Live streams of their otter exhibit, so anyone who wants to can tune in to watch their cute resident otters living their best lives, no matter where you are in the world. These take place over several of the aquarium's social platforms, and they always seem to bring in good numbers. I mean, it's the wholesome content we all need in our lives, really. And these did a lot to raise the awareness of the conservation work of the aquarium, and by extension, they helped to raise a lot of money to fund that work. In 2019, Rosa's fame got perhaps its biggest boost yet, when Douglas Reedon, a Twitch streamer better known by his online alias DugDug, began watching the Ottercam in one of his live streams. It just so happened that this was only a few days before Rosa's 20th birthday, and so he and his chat decided to throw her an online birthday party that would double as a fundraiser for the aquarium, and it was a big success. This started an annual tradition, where every year on Rosa's birthday, DugDug would host an online party/fundraiser, with the streams becoming bigger and better every year. They would last for hours and would also feature the many fan works his audience produced for Rosa. Traditional fan art, of course, but also poetry and even music. Over the years, they would end up raising over 6 figures for the aquarium, all in honour of everyone's favourite otter. The aquarium themselves would also host streams to celebrate Rosa's birthday, which also raised tens of thousands, in which the otter's enclosure would be decorated and they'd be given special treats and enrichment, while their keepers answered viewers' questions about the otters. Oh, and if you're wondering, Rosa's birthday was on the 24th of August. Or at least that was her official birthday. Obviously we don't know the exact date of her birth as she was born in the wild, but I guess that's the closest estimate. Unfortunately, I didn't start researching for this episode until after that date, otherwise I would have loved to have gotten it out in time for that. But I did manage to get it out on the sort of anniversary of her rescue, which is almost as good. For years, Rosa continued to live her best life at the aquarium, being adored by her in-person visitors and online fans, and inspiring countless people to get involved in marine conservation, and especially sea otter conservation, which was particularly important as though sea otter numbers have recovered substantially from when they were believed to be extinct, they're still very much an at-risk species, being classified as threatened by the IUCN. At the age of 22, Rosa finally retired from the aquarium surrogate program. She'd raised 15 healthy, happy babies, most or all of whom had successfully returned to the wild, so she had more than earned some quiet, pampered senior years, leaving the fostering to the younger otters in the exhibit. She remained a firm favourite amongst everyone though, even as her health began to decline. The typical lifespan for a female southern sea otter is about 15 to 20 years, and 20 is considered the absolute maximum. Most don't live that long. So it's not surprising that once Rosa passed that upper threshold, she began to experience some complications. And it was here that the years of clicker training and positive reinforcement really paid off, because they were able to easily train Rosa to put her nose to a target while the eye drops were administered, allowing her to receive the healthcare she needed without being stressed out, restrained or sedated. All of the otters at the aquarium received regular health checks to ensure they were as healthy as possible and that any potential issues were caught early. But the older Rosa got, the more regular her health checks became, until she was having them every single day, and she was weighed at least once a week. These health checks were never invasive, and again, because of her training, she was able to go through them without any distress. Thankfully for Rosa, the aquarium's vet is basically the world's leading expert in sea otter medicine, and there's no doubt that the expert care she received is one of the main reasons for her long life. Sometimes, as Rosa got older, she'd need a bit of a break from the other otters, who were mostly much younger than her and could be pretty rambunctious, so she'd be taken off exhibit and put into a pool away from the public, where she'd enjoy some alone time and be fed her favourite foods. This girl really was spoilt in her later years, and she absolutely deserved it. Apparently, one of her most favourite foods was squid, especially the cow-eye squid. And she became a pickier and pickier eater the older she became, until sometimes she just would refuse to eat unless she was given exactly the thing she wanted. Life goals, honestly. And while the youngsters would sometimes get on her nerves, apparently even in her old age, Rosa was still one of the most playful otters there, and would often play and wrestle with the others. The older Rosa got, the more complications she began to suffer with her health. By this point, she was the second oldest sea otter ever recorded, and the oldest of her particular subspecies, the southern sea otter. In late May and early April 2024, Rosa began to show signs that she had reached the end. Her condition declined, and her behaviour began to change in a way that suggested she was starting to suffer. There was nothing particularly specific that caused her decline, it was just old age. I mean, she was 24 years old. That kind of age is basically unheard of for sea otters. And so Rosa's care team, in consultation with their vet, made the difficult decision to put her to sleep. She passed away peacefully on the 5th of June 2024, surrounded by her caretakers, many of whom had known and worked with her for years. Rosa's legacy lives on, in both the rescued babies she raised and the millions of people who loved her, whether that was through visiting her in person or discovering her online. She helped to educate people, she sparked awareness and compassion for her species, and she brought joy to so many people's lives. Honestly, I think it's the kind of legacy we'd all love to have one day. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Animal Nerd podcast. If you enjoyed it, then it would mean the world if you could support the show by subscribing wherever you're listening to this, rating or reviewing the show, or liking and leaving a comment if you're listening via YouTube, and sharing it with your friends. This podcast is an entirely non-profit venture. Any and all money we make goes to the Little Rescue Zoo, which is an animal sanctuary specialising in exotic pets, as well as disabled and medically complex animals of all species. So by supporting the show, you're also helping to support them, which is pretty cool. New episodes of the Animal Nerd podcast come out every single Tuesday unless I'm ill, plus there are bonus minisodes at least once a month. A list of sources used in this episode, as well as our contact info and social medias, can all be found in the show notes. If you know of an animal, event, or even a person who you think we should make an episode about, then please feel free to email your suggestions to animalnerdpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you again for listening this week, and I will see you in the next one. Stay wild, friends!